Many of you have heard of the great earthquake and volcanic eruption at Mount Vesuvius a few thousand years ago that covered the city of Pompeii. Pompeii was sort of a resort city. It was maybe the Las Vegas of the ancient world, and people would travel from Rome, go on holiday. They had holiday houses there, and so there was a lot of wealth and a lot of debauchery. Well, as the archaeologists went to study the ruins and started digging, they found like entire families gathered around a meal. They didn't even try to run away. Many of them had no clue that it was coming. And it happened so fast that they were just completely covered in lava. And so sort of these lava shells around them, if you will. There were beasts of burden that were still in their stables. They hadn't run. They hadn't taken off or tried, as far as they could tell. They found, interestingly enough, what was probably the first couple as they broke through the lava shell at one home, and it was a husband and wife who were perfectly preserved in their skeletons, both of them holding something that they were clutching in their hands. This is 2,000 years later. You know what they were clutching? Fistfuls of gold. Now, were they that night having a family argument about who was going to pay the bills, who was in charge of the money, or had they heard the eruption and thought, we better get our money before we run, and then they died with their money in their hands? We don't know. But this we do know: you can't take it with you. Have you ever seen a U-Haul behind a hearse? Done a lot of funerals in 33 years, never seen a U-Haul behind a hearse. You cannot take it with you. Now, I've heard of some strange burials, but you cannot take it with you. Jesus in the gospel today speaks to us about the importance of spiritual realities that will last forever, as opposed to material goods that will pass away. And it's all about a brother who's arguing with his brother for the estate. My father was an estate attorney until his 80s, and he would say to me, you wouldn't believe the things people argue about over their families. It's tragic. That's why if you're wise, a good steward of your goods, you will prepare and have things planned for your descendants. What's the legacy you're going to leave? Are you going to leave a family divided, fighting over money? Like apparently that couple, the skeletons, fighting over the gold in their fists? Or will you leave a legacy of love? I had a grandmother I was speaking to just the other day who's going blind, and her little granddaughter is the light of her life, and her granddaughter had come and wrote her a note. And so she brought it to Grandma and said, Grandma, read my note. And she said, well, sweetie, you know I can't read it. Read it to me. So this humble little second or third grader opens up her little note, the card that she had made for her, and she read it to Grandma. And it said, I love you. And Grandma says, that's so sweet. And then the little girl says, now, Grandma, feel the card. So she put it in Grandma's hand, and Grandma felt the card. Do you know that that little girl had learned how to make Braille in some kind of a summer camp with I love you in Braille? Well, Grandma said every time she tells the story, she starts crying. I said, that must be worth so much to you. She said, it's worth far more than $1 million, isn't it? Because, see, that's a spiritual reality, and that will endure forever. The money will go. And there's no problem with the money itself. Obviously, money's used to pay the bills. We've got to accrue that money. But St. Paul says it's the love of money that's the root of all evil. If you look at the corruption in the world, any kind of corruption, I almost guarantee in every case, somebody is making money out of it. That's why Jesus in the gospel today talks to us about the problems with greed. Here, these two brothers are arguing about the estate, and Jesus said, I'm not even getting into that. He's not getting involved in it because he knows the problem with greed. So he tells the parable about the guy who's building up the barns, and he's got to build bigger ones because he's going to keep it all, and it's going to all be great. And the irony is, that night, he will die. And then what happens with all of that? Have I lived for the goods rather than using goods for the good of life? In other words, we often become possessed by our possessions, don't we? Often, we love things and use people instead of using things to love people. We have it upside down. We have it backwards. Jesus knows this. And so he calls us to spiritual goods. I want to tell you about a meeting of some of the movers and shakers of the 1920s. You know, that was a big era before the Great Depression. There were the wealthiest, most powerful men in the U.S. met in Chicago in 1923 at Chicago's Edgewater Beach Hotel. And here were the men at this meeting, this power meeting. President of the largest steel company, president of the largest utility company, president of the largest gas company, president of the New York Stock Exchange, president of the Bank of International Settlements, the biggest wheat speculator in the U.S., the biggest bear from Wall Street, the head of the world's greatest monopoly, and a member of President Harding's cabinet. All right, now this was the meeting, 1923. Remember, the Depression comes in 29. 25 years later, would you like to know what happened to all these power brokers? Well, here it comes whether you want to or not. Charles Schwab, okay, that was the first man referred to. Did you know he died in bankruptcy? He was completely bankrupt. The president of the largest utility company, Samuel Insull, he died penniless. The president of the largest gas company, Howard Hobson, he went insane. The president of the New York Stock Exchange, Richard Whitney, had just gotten out of prison 25 years later. The bank president, Leon Fraser, he died a suicide. The big wheat speculator, Arthur Cutten, he died penniless. The Wall Street bear, Jesse Livermore, died a suicide. The head of the biggest monopoly in the world, Ivar Kruger, he died a suicide. And the member of President Harding's cabinet, Albert Fall, 25 years later had just been released from prison so he could die at home. Every single one of these power brokers ended up in a tragic disaster. It is clear that money and power are not the answers. They do not bring you joy. They can be useful. And many people who have it use it for the good of others. But many do not, and rather dwell in greed. Well, you know, people say money talks. You know what it usually says? Bye-bye. It's going away sooner or later. Goodbye. Well, I want to tell you about a man who was very wealthy and read his obituary one day in the paper. Mistakenly, they put his obituary because a reporter in France got the wrong brother of the Nobels. This was long ago. Albert Nobel, you know, the famous Nobel Prize. So one day, Albert Nobel gets up, opens the paper, and reads an article about his death and the legacy that he left, because he was known as the Dynamite King. And so the article talked about what he did brought about death and destruction around the world, and it shocked him. He thought, is this my legacy? The dynamite, and all that it's been used, how it's been improperly used. So he had to rethink his life and his legacy, and then he decided to create the Nobel Prize. And we know this, it's a prize in physics, the sciences, chemistry, medicine, literature, and of course the famous Peace Prize. And so before Albert Nobel actually died and had a real obituary that was correct, he had made a great transformation and a new legacy. We should do the same. What legacy shall we leave when we die? When we read, or when others read our obituary, will the Lord be pleased? What's our number one priority? Is it acquiring the wealth for our own, maybe even through dishonesty? Is it even acquiring power by becoming ruthless and ruining other people? Is it getting a famous reputation while neglecting those who are in need? We then violate the priority Jesus speaks about acquiring eternal treasures for the life to come in order to obtain passing treasures in this world. What will be our legacy? Remember, Jesus once said, "What would it profit a soul to gain the whole world, but to lose his own soul?" What profit is there in that? Instead, we are called to be stewards. By the way, did you know that the word success is not anywhere in the gospel? Jesus never used the word success. In fact, it's not even in the New Testament. It was in one of the Psalms today, right? The success at the work of our hands. God wants it to be fruitful. Jesus talks about fruitfulness. Jesus talks about service. He said, "The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life in ransom for many." Right? Jesus talks about service, but not about success. It's not, people ask Mother Teresa of Calcutta, well, how many people are you really reaching in India? What kind of a success is this work of yours? And she said she was not concerned about success. She was concerned about reaching this person and this person, one-on-one, one by one. That's our job. That's our mission, one by one, in our own culture, in our own world, right here. St. Paul put it very powerfully. He said, "Seek what is above, not what is on this earth." We have to put to death our immorality, our impurity, our passion, our evil desire, and the greed, there it is again, greed, that is idolatry. It's a false god. Think of what is above, he says. And what are the realities that are above? They are charity, mercy, righteousness, doing the right thing as Jesus would have us do it, justice, peace, and eternal love, like the little card of the little girl to her grandmother in Braille. That was worth more than $1 million. I conclude with the words of a great Jesuit, Blessed Claude de la Colombière, who was the confessor to St. Margaret Mary Alacoque, the nun to whom Jesus appeared as the Sacred Heart. And appropriate today being the 31st of July, the feast day of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit order, Blessed Claude put it this way: "My God, I believe most firmly that you watch over all who hope in you, and that we can want for nothing when we rely upon you in all things. Therefore, I am resolved for the future to have no anxiety, but to cast all my cares upon you." Amen.